light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Hu. As often as I talk about giving life a chance and taking calculated risks and, look before you leap, but give it a chance. On the flip side of that, for everything you can name, there is a positive manifestation and there's also a negative one. Anything can be used or abused. Anything can be used or done in a healthy manner or done in an extreme and abusive manner. Or even a self-sabotaging manner. One of the subjects someone asked me to touch on was gambling. And of course, there are so many different ways that is done and has been done for as long as humanity has been around. On one hand, it's understandable to want to be able to anticipate outcomes because especially in prehistoric times, that could make the difference in surviving or not surviving. The problem, like anything else, though, is when it's taken to an extreme, to where that activity becomes an end in itself, to where it's not about charting life through uncertainties, it's not about anticipating outcomes, it's about making the anticipation the constant activity. I suppose something that's completely different but a similar sort of dynamic. The person who starts going to church as a way of seeking spiritual growth or spiritual development, but it doesn't quite happen the first time, so then they'd go every week, and then they go to every other activity the church is doing, and before long, every single activity that happens at that church, that person is always present. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but when that becomes the activity and the distraction and the obsession, and there is nothing else, it's like attending church or getting involved in gambling or becoming obsessive about stock market trading, becoming obsessive about gardening. Anything can become an obsession. And when it becomes an obsession, it becomes self-sabotaging and destructive, ultimately destructive, especially destructive to one's relationships. In gambling, I guess it's kind of and I have to speak about this as someone observing the phenomena without directly experiencing it, because I've never been an addictive sort of person. But I know that this becomes a major force in many people's lives. So much so that there are organizations oriented around getting away from it and breaking those habits and not being obsessed with it. And I actually, come to think of it, had an aunt who became so obsessed with entering every sweepstakes that was ever published anywhere that it became almost a life-consuming sort of thing, to where her family finally said, "You need to take a break and get help." And she did. Thankfully, she did. She took a couple months off and went to a treatment facility and reordered her thinking and was able to break the addiction to gambling that she had basically practiced for, I think, 2 or 3 decades at that point. It makes sense that there is an adrenaline rush, but when the adrenaline rush becomes the reason for, well, I suppose you could say the reason for living, that everything then becomes about accomplishing another adrenaline rush, perhaps like a drug addict, accomplishing another high, accomplishing another experience of euphoria, just one more time, one more time, one more. And there's a sense of the wholeness of a person that is lost in that process. And you're not really living life anymore, you're just rushing from an experience that was enjoyable once And so it kind of becomes the only experience you ever know, barring all others. But to be a holistically healthy person requires a diversity of experiences the same way that a healthy diet requires a diversity of foods. When the old witticism, man cannot live on bread alone. No, it requires variety. It requires diversity. That's the reason, I grew up with the notion of 4 basic food groups. I've seen several versions since then that have divided it up in other ways according to other criteria. I have never seen one yet that says there is any one food that you can eat at the exclusion of all others, that this is the only thing you need, the only thing you will ever need, and as long as you have this, everything will be perfect. It requires an integrated diversity. And so when it comes to gambling, I guess it becomes a challenge to say what distinguishes gambling from obsession, or are they in fact the same thing? Except that obsessions can be other forms as well. Is all gambling an obsession? I imagine there are a number of people who say no, that they go to a casino every so often as entertainment, but they're not obsessed about it. It doesn't take over their life. If they don't go to the casino and throw away $20 each weekend, they don't feel unhappy about it. They don't feel like they missed out somehow, or like the world isn't normal or right. They go on with their lives, and at some point maybe they'll decide to entertain themselves that way again. I mean, they become no more obsessed about casinos and slot machines and poker tables than I became obsessed about amusement parks after visiting a particular Six Flags amusement park quite a number of years ago. It was enjoyable. It was wonderful. I went to Disneyland once, and that was wonderful. I didn't feel the need to do it again. And not doing it again hasn't negatively impacted my life. When gambling becomes an obsession, when church-going becomes an obsession, when anything becomes an obsession that you cannot be happy unless you've done it. Well, and on that note, when being happy becomes an obsession, when you have to be happy at all costs. I would rather be happy when it's appropriate and sad when it's appropriate, and just a neutral sort of peaceful content when it's appropriate. I don't need to be happy. I don't need to be sad. I don't need to be any particular way except being myself, honestly and truthfully and holistically. I sometimes jokingly refer to the happiness cult, but it really is a phenomenon in our world today. The people who insist that you must be happy at all costs, at all times. It's like they want the emotional meter stuck on happy and moving nowhere else. And it's not healthy. The person who was happy at somebody's funeral, I would say, is not connecting with the loss that has just occurred. The person who cannot emotionally move beyond the funeral, of course, is a whole different matter. At some point, I mean, on one hand, I want to say it's only up to the individual to decide when they have grieved enough. On the other hand, at some point, it has clearly gone way beyond. It has gone on so long that there are negative effects occurring that are more related to the unending grieving than they are to the loss of the loved one. There is an appropriate grieving of loss, and then there is the invitation and the opportunity to rebuild in some new way, to find a new resource, a new method, a new approach, a new way of understanding one's own life. For some elderly people, I understand there's the loss of independence when they get to a point where maybe they can't drive anymore. Or for someone who's been in an accident that might render them blind, that they won't be driving a car anymore. It's sad, it's an adjustment, it's a difficult transition. It's not the end of life. There are ways to redefine and reorient, and keep going with whatever you have left. There was an anecdote about the violinist Isaac Perlman that I read once, in which he was, I don't know if it's a true story or not, I have no reason to believe it isn't. He was playing a concert and one of the strings on his violin broke right in the middle of the piece, and everyone kind of gasped, and after a pause he started playing again, continuing the same piece with the remaining 3 strings. And then another string broke, and again the audience gasped, and he paused, and then he started playing again all the music on the 2 strings that were left. And then another string broke, and everyone looked around wondering, how in the world is this possible? And being the consummate the musician that he was, he actually managed to finish the entire piece on the 1 remaining string. And of course there was a standing ovation and thunderous applause and all this, and the thing you have to remember about Isaac Perlman is that he also has a physical disability. And when he finally got the audience to be quiet again, he said, sometimes it's not so much what you can do with what you have as what you can do with what you have left. In terms of addressing gambling, it kind of comes back to this basic idea of what do you have left, and do you gamble it again or do you not? What choice do you make? Has it become an obsession? Can you walk away and find another path? The question I guess I come back to in all that is to do a hard look in the mirror and decide whether the tail is wagging the dog or the dog is wagging the tail. When it comes to gambling, it's something that can take over your life till, if you let it run to its extreme, there will be nothing left. But that's the way with every single obsession. Whether it's church going or gambling or any other activity, there are people who are obsessed about exercising to the point that it actually begins to take away from the rest of their life and tears at the wholeness of their being. It's not to me it's not appropriate to judge such people, nor is it appropriate to feel sorry for them. What is needed is to be some sort of supportive community that can encourage and draw them back to a place where they can see themselves and where they can find the holistic and better parts of themselves, perhaps parts that they've neglected. But of course then the question becomes, did they neglect it because they chose to, or because they didn't have opportunity, or because nobody noticed it when they did it in the first place? There was one occasion where I was working with some elderly people in a residential facility for elderly people with Alzheimer's. And there was one there was a woman one day who was having a peculiar flashback, and she was not cooperating, and the other staff just wanted to control her. And to me, it wasn't so much about controlling her as it was to connect her with those memories that she still had and those abilities that she still had that would bring out the most beautiful parts of her in ways that would allow her to be in harmony with her environment and to be, as much as possible, the whole person that she was, in a way that would allow for her needs to continue to be met. And it occurred to me at one point that she had mentioned being able to play the piano. And so I implored her to come play something for me on the piano in the lunchroom. And she was willing and happy to do that, and the music helped her to ground for a minute and to reconnect with her environment in a harmonious way. In a similar sort of way, when somebody gets involved in gambling, it's not that we try to control them, restrict them, lock them down, cage them. No, you can't do that. I'm taking all your money away so you can't gamble. It's about loving the person enough to reacquaint them with the wholeness of who and what they are. that it is not just about taking chances, but it is also about carrying something forward of what they have learned and who they have been, who loves them and who they love, the wholeness of their life, not just a split second of wondering which way will it go, not just a split second of adrenaline rush, but a wholeness of being that, well, and I guess it raises the question of whether you can gamble away everything that you are so that there is nothing left. To which I would say, well, at that point, stop and look in the nearest mirror, and what do you see? Assuming you have a reflection, there is still something left. Stepping out of that rut that you may have gotten into, though, that's going to take courage. And courage is not so much being a superior person as it is of reminding yourself and making yourself aware of something that matters more than the rut in which you find yourself apparently stuck, but perhaps not as stuck as some people think. Probably the most discouraging thing in that at that particular moment in life is to be surrounded by people who don't see anything more than the negative appearance they're looking at, who don't see the gambler's wholeness, who don't see a person with a history and a person with likes and dislikes and abilities and preferences and potentialities that have not begun to be explored yet. I suppose in a sense, and this, perhaps this is using the metaphor against itself, when gambling becomes an obsession, it's imperative to gamble on the possibility that there is more to the person than just the gambling habit. That there is something else there that may have nothing to do with gambling, but has everything to do with creative expression. That may have everything to do with establishing new relationships, with establishing new experiences and new connections. It may involve horrendously big jumps. It may involve a season of loss. Where I am today, I would not be if it were not for the last couple years of loss that I have gone through. And it has been a terrible, horrible loss. And in many cases, it was because of people abusing their positions of authority. And I was unable to persuade them to see outside of that. They had gambled on the idea that they had all the answers they needed and did not need any more information about anything, and did not need to develop any further, did not need to learn or grow or anything. And the problem with gambling on that is that you lose by getting what you say will make you win. And that's kind of a complicated way of but I'm trying to point out how it's because they gambled on the possibility that they knew everything that they needed to know, and they feel that they won that, and so yes, I do know everything I need to know, which of course isn't true. But because they think they won, they actually lost, because everything that comes after that was now out of reach. I guess in a way, to me, that suggests that in the end, there is no such thing as a gambler who wins. That there are ups and downs and a peculiar sort of unfolding of life. But in the end, if you haven't learned anything, and if you haven't loved anyone, and if it's been about nothing more than the acquisition of financial assets, you lose, because none of those go with you. it's like the story I heard somewhere a few years ago, and I've shared it in other episodes also, but I guess it bears repeating. The man who argued with God for the right to take it with him, and God finally relented and said he could if he really wanted to that badly. And when the man arrived at the pearly gates to heaven and insisted to Peter that he had permission to bring it all with him, and he was dragging this huge chest, and Peter said, well, okay, but could I ask what you've got in there? And the man said, sure, and very proudly throws the lid back, and it's piled high with gold coins. And Peter stares for a long moment and says, your treasure is pavement? We use that to pave the streets up here. In heaven it was no better than asphalt. It's not my money, it's not your money, it's the world's money, and the world will keep it. And if all you're getting from the money is this rush of adrenaline that accomplishes nothing for yourself or for anyone else, that serves no higher purpose, that if we don't live for something greater than ourselves, our lives become small and petty in their proportions, regardless of what our alleged financial net worth is. It doesn't go to the cemetery with you. It doesn't go to heaven with you. It doesn't, and it seems to me that those who use their fortunes for the betterment of humanity and the betterment of others are generally remembered a whole lot longer than those who use it for nothing more than the betterment of themselves. And if you can really be that, well, I say superficially, I'm sure I could meet people who would say, as long as they're in bliss, in blissful euphoria till the day they die, as long as they always have everything they want, they can die and it's over with and that's all there is to it, and they enjoyed it and they don't care how selfish they were. And, once they're gone, everybody fights over their estate and erases where they were and remodels their house, and there's nothing to say that they were ever here. To me, that's a tragic waste of a life. But it also raises the question of, what if there is something else? What if there is something more, and you get there and find that all the resources that you selfishly squandered, accomplished nothing, and you're that much further behind because you had blessings, but you didn't learn anything from them. And you had abilities, but you didn't bless anyone with them. And, is all of this saying you need to help others because otherwise you've got judgment waiting for you? I have no way of knowing that. But I have never met a person who was generous and loving to those around them who regretted being so. I've met people whose trust was betrayed, and that was very painful, a very painful experience to go through. And in some cases, it made them cynical and pessimistic, and in other cases, they became a more mature person through it. Why do we do any good at all? I guess it comes down to, it's for each person to learn for themselves. But I continue to find that when I invest myself in others, it makes me the most happy. And it's the happiness that has the fewest side effects. If I try spending all the money on myself, whatever money I have at whatever point, trying to make myself happy, it has never succeeded. I'm pathetic when it comes to making myself happy by spending money, because nothing I ever do that way brings me happiness. Am I like you? Are you like me? I suppose in some ways we're alike and in some ways we're different. What I invite you through watching this show and through contemplation of your own life is to go from gambling on nothing more than adrenaline rush to gambling on the possibility that you could be so much more, and that you could do things that you thought were impossible, and that you could be loved and remembered by more people than you believed possible. And that even if nobody appreciates you, you can die knowing you did a good thing. When it comes down to the end of life, what really matters and what do we decide matters and on what basis do we decide it matters. What comes to mind is this wonderful scene in the movie The Astronaut Farmer, where he says he's commenting on how his dad committed suicide when he ran out of money and he was losing his world, and he said, and what I see in that is that not only it wasn't that my dad was dying so much or that he was losing the ranch, is that he was giving up. And he said, whatever happens today, my children will know that I didn't give up, and I can die knowing that. When we live for something greater than ourselves, our lives take on proportions and meaning that no adrenaline rush could ever equal. And the universe becomes a much bigger place in which to live, and to live beyond the constraints of a mere physical body. I hope something that I've shared in the last half hour has been helpful to you. I realize I'm talking from my own experience quite a bit. I hope it serves as some kind of reference point so that you can make sense of your own experience and find the things that matter to you, the things that matter deeply and broadly and enduringly, not just momentarily. That it's not just a momentary gambling to see win or lose in this very small situation in the tininess of the moment, but creating a life that is so massive there's no way it can lose. Thank you for watching.